Hello everyone,
and welcome to today's session,
Three critical protections
for your Microsoft Cloud migration.
I'd like to introduce today's presenters. Today we have Ru Ting Sun.
He's a product marketing manager here at Duo Security, where he drives many of our product launches and go-to-market initiatives.
And prior to Duo,
he held product marketing and product management positions at various tech firms, including the security business at Barracuda.
And Ru Ting holds
a bachelor's degree in quantitative finance from Michigan State University.
And I
am a lucky person because I get to work with Ru Ting on a regular basis.
Really
knowledgeable and actually a really great part of our marketing and product marketing team here at Duo. So always a joy for me to work with, and we'll be presenting to you today and also answering questions at the end of the presentation. So make sure that you enter your questions as you think of them into that question panel, and Ru Ting will make sure to answer everything at the end.
A recorded version of the webinar will be available
after the webinar concludes.
And for those
of you just now joining us, welcome to the webinar.
The webinar topic is
three critical protections for your Microsoft Cloud migration.
And without further ado,
I'm going to hand it over to Ru Ting. So take it away, Ru Ting.
Thanks, Kim. This is Ru Ting here with Duo. As she mentioned before, there's a lot of interesting things happening in the Microsoft Cloud migration arena right now. As many of you probably know, Microsoft held their annual customer conference, Microsoft Ignite, in Atlanta at the end of September, that Duo was lucky enough to actually participate in, and we worked pretty heavily with the Microsoft teams prior to Ignite, as well as on an ongoing basis, even after Ignite, both on the product management and product development side, as well as on the product marketing and go-to-market partnership side. So a lot of things there for customers to actually think about when they make the migration to the Microsoft Cloud, whether that's moving your email infrastructure from on-premises Exchange to Office 365, or it's moving some of your own infrastructure into the Azure platform. There's a lot of security considerations to taking into consideration when you're making this move. So to level set everyone before we get started, this is kind of the agenda that I had in mind for today's webinar. What I wanted to do is kind of walk everyone through what the state of security looks like from our perspective with regards to how likely end users are to be targeted by various attacks, as well as how likely are the devices that they use likely to be targeted by different types of attacks, and what that really means for the Microsoft Cloud migration. As I mentioned before, some of the largest migrations that we're seeing today within the Microsoft universe really boils down to moving email workloads from on-prem Exchange to Office 365. But there's a couple of other things around desktop workloads, as well as directory workloads from on-premises Active Directory into Azure AD. And there's a lot of people that are actually using a hybrid model with Active Directory federation services to federate on-premises and off-premises identity into a single service. So we'll look a little bit at the numbers of what the cloud migration story looks like for Microsoft and what some of those numbers are today. And then we'll kind of bring those two things together. So what that actually means for your security posture, what that means for your security infrastructure, and how Duo actually can help keep you safe as you migrate from the on-prem Microsoft world into the cloud-based Microsoft world with 365 and Microsoft Azure. And then we'll actually follow that up with a demo. So it'll be a pretty quick and short and sweet demo to kind of just give you what the in-product experience looks like when you integrate a Microsoft workload or a Microsoft application with Duo for both two-factor as well as securing access into that particular Microsoft application. And we'll round out the rest of the hour with a quick question and answer session where you guys are free to kind of you guys are free to ask any questions that you would like through this presentation. It looks like someone mentioned that there's a pretty bad echo. Can everyone else hear me? Okay, can you type into the questions from the audience section if you can hear me? Okay. Okay, it looks like maybe it's just one person that is having issues here. So we'll go ahead and get started. So the state of security with regards to Microsoft devices that we see here at Duo, our labs team does quite a bit of research into the state of device health across a number of different device platforms. So we don't look at just Windows devices. We also look at Android devices. We look at iOS devices. And we also don't look at just mobile devices. We also look at and traditional endpoints like laptops and desktops also. And the specific startling point around Windows devices, I think, is just looking at the sheer number of devices that are actually out of date. If you think about all of the different Windows operating systems that are out there, 65% of them are actually still running Windows 7. So that's a pretty big difference in terms of, and pretty startling disconnect in terms of where we are today on the operating systems. If you think about it, Windows 10 was released fairly recently, and Windows 7 actually, Microsoft ended general support for Windows 7 earlier in 2015. So the majority of the market, surprisingly, is actually still running on a 7-year-old version of Windows that is effectively not getting much general supportability in terms of operating system updates, in terms of service packs, et cetera, that really address some of the biggest security vulnerabilities that are out there today. So that's a pretty startling point. And then if you double click on that number a little bit and you look at what the other software platforms are that are running on Windows 7, and you look at the number of devices that are running Internet Explorer, which is the default web browser that Microsoft offers within the Windows platform, 20% of those devices are actually running Internet Explorers 8, 9, and 10. As many of you might know, the Internet Explorer 8, 9, and 10 versions were actually end-of-lifed and ended support earlier this year in 2016. And the fact that 1 out of every 5 devices that's out there are still on these unsupported versions is actually a pretty big risk from an exposure and vulnerability perspective. And then you couple that with the fact that about 40% of those devices that are running Internet Explorer in generally have an old version of Flash installed. And as many of you probably know, plugins like Adobe Flash Player as well as Java tend to be the biggest hotbeds of device vulnerabilities that we really see out there. If you look at the top 10 common vulnerabilities and exploits list, 80% of those exploits and vulnerabilities are actually rooted in Flash bugs. So those 3 things really kind of add up to be the perfect storm, so to speak, of just how bad the state of security is on a lot of users' Microsoft devices and Windows devices. And the challenge with that really is that you don't necessarily have great visibility into a lot of these. So we'll talk a little bit about the BYOD initiatives that a lot of our customers are going through today, and some of the things that they're doing to mitigate the threats around BYOD devices. But the biggest problem that we actually see from these devices is that, one, you have no idea a lot of times where these devices are or who they belong to and who owns them. And at the same time, you don't necessarily have a great idea of what those devices have access to, what critical applications they have access to, if they're actually logging into your VPN, if they have access to your corporate networks, while at the same time still running very, very out-of-date software, both at the operating system level as well as at the application level with browsers as well as plugins. So that's a little bit on the state of security from the devices perspective. I want to also talk a little bit about from the user perspective. What we actually see here at Duo is that while about 75% of all data breaches across the board happen because of out-of-date devices, close to 95% of data breaches actually happen because a user's credentials were compromised. And most often what that means is that their passwords were stolen. And what we found is that email phishing is actually still one of the most effective ways at stealing passwords. We recently launched a free tool here at Duo called Duo Insight, which is actually a free phishing simulation tool that companies can use to basically run phishing simulations on their end users to see who is likely to fall for things like targeted spear phishing attacks. And there's a number of different business templates and application templates that you can use, between Google Docs and Salesforce and Office 365 to kind of mimic the type of phishing campaigns that you actually see the bad guys using out there. And the numbers are actually pretty startling. So we launched this product in July of this year, so roughly about 3 months ago, and we've got a tremendous amount of data that we've sifted through, and thousands of organizations that have actually used this free product to really get a better understanding of what their end user state of security looks like, as far as how aware they are to phishing and how prone they are to falling for phishing attacks. And if you can see here on the left, the pie chart on the left actually shows what the victim rate is in terms of the people that have actually clicked on the phishing link versus people that didn't click on it. And what you see is about 31%. So almost 1 in 3 people that receive a phishing email and has a link actually click on that link. And then if you take that one step further and you look at the number of people that actually enter in their credentials, 1 in 6 actually entered in their corporate credentials. So those numbers are actually pretty startling if you think about the fact that a lot of breaches, all it really takes is just one person who has the right level of access and the right level of responsibility to be compromised or to be breached before an attacker can kind of start their APT campaign effectively. So between these two charts, what that really shows is that end user awareness to things like targeted spear phishing attacks, to things like clickbait, is probably still not at the level that it needs to be at. And we, both in the security vendor community as well as security practitioners, can do a much better job of making sure that our end users are aware of these types of things. And again, this data set spans across thousands and thousands of companies that have actually used Duo Insight to run these campaigns, as well as getting data from tens of thousands of end users. And the other thing that is scary here that I should mention is that a lot of people think that phishing is really a credential problem. Phishing is not just a credential problem. It's actually just as much an endpoint problem as it is a credential problem. And the reason for that is because your users don't necessarily have to actually enter in their username and password to be phished. A lot of times, there's a lot of clickbait malware that's actually installed behind a particular link. And so the sheer nature of me actually clicking on the link itself can actually download some malware or some something that a Trojan or anything like that can actually remotely execute arbitrary code against my machine and look for exploits. So it's really kind of a perfect storm if you combine this slide with the previous one in terms of how many devices are out of date. Simple clickbait malware and simple clickbait viruses actually take advantage of a lot of the vulnerabilities that we see out there. So keep that in mind as you think about phishing and end user awareness. It's not just a credential compromise problem. It's just as much an endpoint problem as it is the other. So with that in context, let's take a look at what we see across our customer base in terms of Microsoft Cloud adoption. Again, keep in mind that this is obviously a webinar about how you actually protect and secure your Microsoft Cloud migration. And Microsoft is actually pushing very hard for folks to actually move to their public cloud platform, both for Office 365, for the Office Productivity Suite, as well as for Azure to be your kind of compute infrastructure, as well as your software platform. And what you see is actually Office 365 is actually seeing tremendous growth over the last year or so. So the chart on the left here, the stark difference between the 22.3% and the 6.8%, that happened over the course of basically 9 months. The number of enterprise seats of all the companies out there that are active on Office 365 went from just under 7% in the third quarter of 2015 to almost 1 in 4 enterprise users being on Office 365. by effectively June or July of this year. That's the Office 365 side. So if you look at the Azure momentum in the box on the left, Microsoft is seeing roughly 120,000 new Azure customer subscriptions every single month. That's a pretty startling number, and they're actually seeing about 5 million organizations using Active Directory, and that number is actually growing pretty quickly as well, using Azure Active Directory. So a lot of customers are moving email workloads and productivity workloads into Office 365, and a lot of people are moving directory workloads into the Azure AD ecosystem rather than on-premises AD. Those are probably the two biggest numbers that we're going to focus on for the sake of this presentation. But if you're interested to see what the adoption in Azure has been, check out some of the Ignite talks that focus specifically on Microsoft Azure, and you'll see what the adoption rate has been as Microsoft gets people to move on to their public cloud platform. It's actually quite impressive. So with that being said, we're going to do a quick poll of the audience before we move forward. We talked a lot about Office 365 and how quickly folks were moving to Office 365 as part of their enterprise productivity suite. I'm curious to get answers from the audience. What email service are you guys using today? Are you already on 365? Is there a plan to move there? Are you guys still on-premises Exchange and using maybe it's Outlook Web Access for remote access into email, or are you using some other kind of corporate email system like Google Apps and Gmail? So, Kim, can you go ahead and start the poll, and we'll read out the results as they come in.
Excellent.
Excellent.
Thanks, Jane.
Thanks, Jane. And the poll should be live right now.
So if
you want to look over on the right-hand side of your screen, I believe that's where you'll see the options.
Yep.
Answering that.
I don't see the numbers changing yet. I'm not sure if. Oh, there we go.
Great.
So we've got two people who have actually put their votes in. It looks like it's a 50-50 split between Office 365 and on-prem Exchange. And from a relatively small sample set that we're seeing here, it's actually pretty representative of what we actually see in the market. So right now it's about 2/3 of the market is on on-prem Exchange. 1/3 of our audience is on Office 365. And that number seems to be holding as we get more and more votes in. Some other folks actually using other email services. Maybe it's Google Apps, maybe it's something else. So that's actually pretty indicative of actually what we see across our customer base is a pretty close split actually right now between Office 365 and on-prem Exchange. Amongst all the people that we have, about 40% of the customers that we have right now are on Office 365 or already have some migration path towards 365, and then about 4 in 10 also are still on on-prem Exchange and have no plans to move. And then Google Apps and other email services tend to make up the back half of that number. So interesting. It's interesting to see that this webinar audience actually has a very similar adoption pattern to most of the customers that we have out there, as well as what Microsoft is claiming for the numbers themselves. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about the cloud and mobile device challenges that we actually see in the market today. As you're migrating applications and workloads into the cloud, as well as whether or not you're actually in control of your own bring your own device initiative, or it's just kind of been something that end users have adopted and you just kind of have to live with from the IT and from the security side. There's a lot of the challenges that I think everybody resonates with here on this screen. For the users, I think most of our customers are really asking questions around making sure that they know who their users are, right? So before you actually get access into an application, before you get access into some critical network service, making sure that we can verify and validate just who you are. Are you an employee? Are you a contractor with the company? Are you a temp worker? And what group do you belong in? We're seeing an increasing number of organizations using role-based access control policies to actually filter out who has access to what applications and who has access to what workloads, depending on the corporate group that they belong in, whether that's engineering, maybe it's marketing or sales or finance, but really curating what applications are used depending on the role that you have within the organization. And then we actually see a lot of people who are actually asking questions around how risky is that particular user, or how compromised are your credentials? Do you have a history of being phished? And part of the reason why we launched the Duo Insight product back in July was really to help customers better understand the user risk that they have within their organization, know how many people they have within the company that are risky users that tend to be have their credentials compromised, and then put together an action plan to not only mitigate the risk coming from those users, but also to help address that risk and hopefully get that number down throughout time. And then on the devices side, it's about understanding, one, what device it is, so the most basic understanding of, is it an iPhone, is it a laptop, but as well as whose device it is, right? The challenge that we have with BYOD today is that a lot of the devices that are actually accessing corporate workloads are not actually company blessed endpoints. So they're not laptops and they're not tablets that a corporate IT team has actually blessed and has distributed out to the employees. It's actually me using my personal iPhone, or it's me using my personal laptop, that the IT team or the central security team really has no visibility into what the configuration of that device is, what the security hygiene of that device is. Are the browsers up to date? Is the operating system up to date? What's the patch level for the different pieces of software that you actually have on that device? There's a lot of things that tend to get missed when you're talking about a device that is a BYOD device rather than a corporate managed device. And then on the app side, as we make this migration to use more cloud-based services and software as a service effectively, and stop hosting every piece of workload on our own premises, you have to really ask the question around what types of apps do you want to grant access into, right? So how critical are those applications? Most of our customers tend to kind of break out their application severity into 3 different buckets. They have very low risk applications that pretty much anyone from anywhere can access, and there's not a lot of confidential corporate information on there. There's some medium risk applications that you may want to put some lightweight controls around, whether that's making sure that a device is up to date, or making sure that you can only access it from certain networks. And then there are very high risk applications, and you may use a combination of certificate-based enforcement. You may use a combination of network access control and doing some multi-factor authentication on it before you can actually access some of those applications. And it also matters where that app is hosted. At the end of the day, if it's hosted behind your network firewall within your perimeter, it's much easier to control and much easier to protect than if you were to try to do something similar for like a SaaS application. So those are some of the challenges that we see a lot of our customers dealing with today as they migrate applications to the cloud and as they deal with BYOD and mobile security challenges. And I think for the most part, a lot of those are the same ones that are non-customers and just companies out there in general are dealing with. And the solution that we've really created for everyone is this concept of offering a trusted access path for a lot of Microsoft applications. And so what does that mean? What that means is that for users, making sure that you can verify the trust of that user and verify the risk of that user before allowing them access to an application, whether that's done through multi-factor authentication and offering a variety of different authentication factors, right? We'll talk a little bit in a later slide about all the different factors of auth methods that Duo actually provides, but also making sure that it's a usable experience. We've moved away, long gone are the token, the hardware token-based days where you get a 6-digit code and you have to go and type that in, and if you lose the little key fob, then you have to go and call IT and replace it, or if the battery dies, you have to do something. That's not a really usable security experience. So we want to move people away from that concept, because the more pain that you make, the more painful you make the authentication and login experience for the user, the less likely that they are to use it, and by nature, the less secure you actually are. We'll also talk about what Duo does around securing access on devices, ensuring that your devices are up to date, ensuring that they are securely configured and securely managed. And our approach is a little bit different from everybody else's in the sense that we actually deploy no agents on the devices themselves. So a lot of the MDM approaches, a lot of the enterprise mobility management approaches that you see today traditionally deploy some kind of an endpoint or some kind of a profile on the device. We're able to actually enforce a lot of access control without implementing any agent on the device, so that you can truly actually cover both your managed devices as well as those unmanaged BYOD devices that you don't have visibility into. And then again, building out that set of policy also depends on what the application is, how risky that application is, as well as where that application resides, whether it's in a third-party service or it's in your own on your own premises and in your own data centers. So let's talk really quickly about the usable authentication piece for Microsoft apps. About 80% of our customers and end users today actually use this concept of Duo Push, which is basically a one-tap authentication to get into an application for your second factor, rather than having to type in, a soft token or a 6-digit code. Now, that being said, we do support a variety of different authentication methods for your end users. So as you can see on here, you can use our Duo mobile app to generate a soft token. We support SMS, even though we don't necessarily recommend it. It is not the most secure form of two-factor. And so we try to actually get as many customers to move away from SMS-based two-factor verification as easily as we possibly can. And there's a number of other ways, right? Like we can actually use our fingerprints because most smartphones today actually have biometrics and Touch ID enabled on them. You can also use something like U2F tokens or universal two-factor tokens, which is basically another form of a one-tap login. And we'll demonstrate actually some of these methods as we go through the demo. But really, usable authentication is really key because you want to make sure that whatever auth methods that you've put in front of your end users is something that is easy for them to adopt, rather than kind of the traditional security philosophy or idea that it needs to be hard and your end users need to have to struggle through it in order for you to feel secure. And going in line with kind of the usable authentication and usable user experience concept, we also offer single sign-on capabilities for all of your Microsoft and other cloud apps, right? So we'll demonstrate this as well, where I'll effectively log into our single sign-on portal that you can connect to your directory service, and then you can just simply integrate all of the different cloud applications as well as on-premises web-based applications that you have into our SSO portal, and you basically get a true single sign-on experience. You log in once, and you're able to actually sign into all of the other applications that are federating against that one identity store. And the one thing that is different from our SSO product versus everyone else's out there is that because we're taking this approach from a security perspective, we're actually checking the hygiene of the device every single time it's trying to access an application. So even though you've logged into our SSO portal, we actually still will do a device health check to make sure that it's up to date, to make sure that it meets and matches the security requirements of what you've laid out as far as policies go within your company. We'll do that at every single time that device tries to actually access an application, even though the user may have already logged in via the SSO workflow. So let's talk a little bit about devices. Again, like I said, we don't require any agents on the devices themselves. And so what that actually allows you to do is actually truly cover both managed and unmanaged devices. So even the ones that you have no visibility into that are BYOD devices, you'll be able to get information on those devices based on what the operating system is, the browsers, the plugins, whether or not that phone is jailbroken, whether or not disk encryption has been turned on, and a number of other attributes and telemetry data about the device. And that happens across the board for laptops, it happens for mobile devices, desktops. We're basically grabbing that information every single time the endpoint is actually interacting with us for the second factor, rather than requiring any agent to be deployed on the device to gather that information. So it's a different way, a different approach that we think is a lot less intrusive in terms of getting information about the device and then making security policy recommendations, as well as enforcing security policies based on those device attributes. And we also actually help a lot of our Microsoft customers keep good device hygiene. So there's actually a pretty intuitive end user workflow that actually helps end users remediate the out-of-date devices they have themselves. So instead of putting all of the onus on the IT team or putting all the onus on the security team, you bring end users into the fold so that they can actually help keep their own devices up to date. And you can enforce those policies for both your corporate devices as well as your BYOD devices. And we'll actually go through this as part of the demo as well. But you can set up these policies for a specific application. You can set it up for a group of applications, or you can actually set it at the global level. So a lot of really granular capabilities in terms of configuring and figuring out what devices you want to allow access from and what devices you don't want to allow access from. So we talked about the user risk and user attributes, as well as the device risk and device attributes that get taken into consideration when you build out your security policy. Let's take a look at what some of the top Microsoft workloads are that we see our customers moving from. So on-premises Exchange obviously is moving quickly into an Office 365 multi-tenant environment. We also see a lot of people actually moving their remote desktop sessions and their Windows servers from on-prem into the Azure cloud as well. And so we some of the top Duo integrations with regards to Microsoft are actually Windows Server logins as well as remote desktop services logins, and we're seeing a lot of those workloads actually move from a customer's own data center into the Microsoft cloud. Similarly, we're actually seeing the same migration for directory services. People who have kept Active Directory on-prem for 10, 20, 30 years are actually making that migration or thinking about how to make that migration to Azure AD. We definitely see that customers are struggling with this piece quite a bit. Microsoft has launched a number of different products and tools to help you migrate your directory service into the cloud, ADFS being one of them. They also recently announced something called Active Directory Pass-Through Authentication at Microsoft Ignite. So if you're not familiar with that, make sure to check out Microsoft's new Pass-Through Authentication methods for being able to actually authenticate cloud application logins against an on-premises directory service without needing an ADFS server. But we're seeing that migration in general as well. The general trend is people are moving to cloud-based directory services like Azure AD, or even a lot of people are actually moving to Google's Identity Cloud and Identity Platform also. So we want to make sure that we work with you guys to protect and secure all of these Microsoft applications and more, regardless of whether you're in an on-prem environment or you're in a cloud environment. And what we actually realize for a lot of these customers is that the migration from on-prem Exchange to Office 365 doesn't happen overnight. We see that a lot of people actually make this move incrementally. And so there may be a 6-month period, there may be a 12-month period where you're actually running both your on-prem Exchange and Office 365 at the same time. We want to make sure that we help you protect both while you're in this migration period. Another quick question here that we wanted to ask the audience. In terms of the identity services and directory services, what are you guys using today? Are you still on-premises Active Directory today? Have you already moved to Azure AD? Are you kind of in the middle with a hybrid approach, leveraging ADFS, or have you actually gone with third-party cloud identity providers that you're just basically layering on top of your Active Directory infrastructure, like a OneLogin or like an Okta or a Ping? So why don't we go ahead and launch this survey also, and we'll wait for the results to come in, and then we can talk a little bit about those.
And you should
be seeing that survey live on your screen right now, so you can go ahead and answer that. Love to hear from you guys.
hope everybody's
seeing that.
Yep. We're getting some results coming in now, and it looks like a lot of folks are actually still on-premises AD today. Maybe a better question would have been, do you have plans to move to Azure AD? We've definitely heard from Microsoft an acknowledgement that Azure AD is not the easiest thing to make this migration to. A lot of people have a lot of different directory forests, they have a lot of different trees, and so consolidating all of these things and moving them to a single directory in the Microsoft Cloud is more challenging than Microsoft thought it would be. And so there's definitely a lot of work that's actually being done right now in terms of Microsoft building out a set of tools to help customers move from on-prem AD to Azure AD. But I think that's going to be an incremental game as we go along. And we're seeing some results come in with folks using IAM vendors like Okta and Ping and OneLogin and ADFS as well, really to kind of federate between your on-premises and your cloud identity services and all of the different cloud applications that you want to be able to tie that into. So a pretty even split actually across the board. Obviously, on-prem AD dominates well over 90% of the market today. So we'll definitely see more numbers around on-prem AD just purely because of the history of it. But it's a pretty even split actually between people leveraging Azure Active Directory, ADFS, and third-party IAM vendors like Okta and OneLogin and Ping to do that federation for them. So that is actually pretty in line with what we've seen throughout our customer base, as well as what Microsoft has actually told us. So great. So just to recap before we go into the demo, for us, building out a path of trusted access for our customers means that our customers can effectively verify that users get very strong user authentication, that it's very usable authentication, and that the devices that they're using to access certain applications and certain workloads are up to date, that they are protected, and that those devices have secure configurations on them. And whether or not it's a managed device or it's an unmanaged device, being able to build access policies depending on who owns that device also becomes very important. And that should actually, those sets of policies should apply to any application, regardless of whether that lives in the Microsoft Cloud or that lives in your own data center. And those policies should really be able to be configured at an app-specific level rather than just at the network level. So the problem that we see with traditional, with traditional remote access portals like VPNs is that when you give access to a particular application behind a VPN, very few people are actually doing proper network segmentation. What you typically end up doing is just giving entire network access, and you just have one VPN that fronts everything. And so now if a user needs access to an internal web app, it may be a Microsoft app, it may not be a Microsoft app, but so long as they need access to one internal web application, what we find most customers doing today is actually just giving them VPN access to the entire network, of which that one application is a part of. That's a pretty risky approach if you think about it, because you're not really segmenting your access policies and your control based on what users actually need. It's more of a function of how the network and the architecture has been built out rather than what the actual business needs of those end users are. And it really actually maximizes your surface area of attack if you're giving broad access rights to every user that is coming in through the VPN. So we take a much more concerted effort to make sure that the policies are built the right way, and making sure that you have application-specific access policies for both your cloud applications as well as for your on-premises internal web apps. And that's something that we're happy to work with customers on also, especially as we introduce some of the new features in our product roadmap for the next couple months coming forward. But across the board, today we're securing about 500,000 Microsoft end users and their access to some of the critical Microsoft workloads that we talked about in the previous slides. And those are really some of the lessons that we've learned from our audience and from our customers in terms of what are the things that they're looking for to protect in order to really bolster their security posture, and what are some of the things that they're thinking about when they think about user security, as well as when they think about mobile device security moving forward. So with that, let's go into the demo. Like I said before, the demo is actually a pretty short and sweet demo. What we're basically going to cover are two things. I'm going to actually use an out-of-date device to basically access two different resources. If you remember from what I said earlier, most of our customers break out their the severity of their resources and who has access to it into really three buckets. The first bucket is kind of the low risk applications that really doesn't have any sensitive corporate data in it that anybody can access from anywhere. And then you have slightly more kind of the medium risk applications that you want to impose a set of restrictions on, or at least you want to alert end users about if they are coming from a vulnerable device. And then you have other resources that you may treat as much more high risk that you want to enforce stricter network access control and policies around. So the two applications that we'll actually do here for the demo is going to be Office 365 and let's say your Cisco SSL VPN. So we're going to jump into the screen share really quickly. And can you guys just verify that you can see my screen okay? Okay, cool. So we're going to go ahead and go forward with this demo. So I'm at demo.duo.com, which is our demo site. And on this page, you can actually see that we have a bunch of self-service demos that you can kind of walk yourself through. We just recently launched our secure single sign-on portal that basically federates multiple cloud applications and soon internal web apps actually against your identity service. And then gives you that single sign-on experience for your end users, but at the same time, still making sure that the device health checks are happening every single time an application is being called upon, so that you can provide a good end user experience without jeopardizing your security posture. We also have various other demos around how Duo Push actually works, which is one of the things that we're actually going to show you now, as well as the self-remediation workflow, which is also something that we'll show you now in access control. So what you see down here are all the different applications that we have on the demo site. We integrate with an endless number of applications. We have out-of-box native support for about 250 to 300 applications at this point, but using LDAP connector or using a Radius integration or the SDK that we have, or integrating us through the authentication APIs that we provide, we can effectively provide authentication and device security for any application that you're looking to integrate us with. These are just some of the top applications that we've seen customers use in the past. So why don't we go ahead and start with Office 365 here. I'm going to click on 365. Now, keep in mind, this is obviously a demo site, so the data in the back end has really been faked. It's more or less to show you what the workflow looks like if your end users were to log into 365 and have Duo integrated with Microsoft Office 365 for the login experience. So on the left-hand side, what you see is actually the login screen to get into 365. The right-hand side is actually my own personal phone. And the reason why I show my phone on the right-hand side is because what you'll see is that the end user smartphone is actually going to act as the second factor, rather than what you're traditionally used to seeing with hardware tokens and key fobs and things of that nature. So I'm going to go ahead and type in my username here. I'm going to go ahead and type in my password. Obviously, this is a demo site, so the password doesn't really actually matter that much. But this would be your primary credentials that you have here. So there's no such thing as duo credentials because we are the second factor. This would effectively be your primary credentials, your LDAP password, whatever sits in Active Directory. I'm going to hit login. Now, remember I said we were running an out-of-date version of Internet Explorer. And so what you actually see on the bottom here is a notice telling me that my computer software is actually over 3 years out of date. That's because I'm actually running Internet Explorer 10 on this machine to basically show what the self-remediation workflow and access control actually looks like. If you remember from the very beginning of our webinar, one of the stats that we read out was that 20% of all of the browsers that are being used out there are either on 8, 9, or 10 for IE. So let's assume that this is one of those browsers. So I can either go ahead and update this now, or I can say, you know what, I'm an end user with pretty bad hygiene. I don't really care about this. I just want to get into my application. So I'm going to go ahead and have Duo send me a push. And what you see on the right-hand side is basically a login request for Office 365. I can basically just simply swipe view here, and it'll actually ask me to approve or deny the transaction. So I'm going to go ahead and approve this. And you see it asked me for me to log into the device itself. So I'm going to go ahead and just put my thumbprint down. And that's all it takes. And you see on the left-hand side now, it tells me, hey, your Internet Explorer is actually out of date. Your IT or your security team actually recommends that you use the latest version. And out-of-date browsers are really a security concern. Your version is over 3 days out of date. So if I was an end user and at this point, it triggers something in me to say, oh, wow, that's actually really bad. And I hit see how to update Internet Explorer. I just have to click that and automatically actually takes me to the update page and the download page on Microsoft.com for updating my browser. Now, let's say I'll do this later. I'm not going to worry about this right now. I can hit the skip button here and just go ahead and log into my Office 365 workload. So that's for a medium risk application like 365, where you have a lot of sensitive data in there, but you don't necessarily want to get in the way of your end users being able to access their work or get access to the things that they need to get access to. So maybe you don't see 365 as being super high critical, where you have to have an up-to-date device and you have to have a protected device to access it. Let's change gears really quickly and actually go into a different demo. Let's actually take the Cisco SSL VPN, for example. After all, Cisco VPNs are probably the market leader in terms of offering VPN services. So I think this is pretty representative of most of the market. And we're going to basically go through the exact same workflow. I'm going to type in my username and password. I'm going to hit login. And instead of actually even prompting me for a second factor, what you actually see here is that we've detected that this browser is over 3 years out of date. And we're going to say, hey, you know what? Access is not allowed to this particular application because it is a high-risk application and you have out-of-date software. And if I was an end user and I hit, see what is allowed, what it tells me is basically the same message that you saw before. But the only difference is that there's no skip capability here for me to actually get access into the VPN. Right? And if I hit see how to update Internet Explorer, again, it takes me to the same page to actually go through the self-remediation process. So what you're seeing here is basically a better network access control experience simply because we're sitting in the path of access for various applications. And we can implement this level of control for both your cloud applications like 365, Salesforce, Google, as well as on-premises services like your RDP sessions, your VPN sessions, if you're using some kind of an application delivery controller to front-end different apps behind that, and you want to tie us in with the gateway for the ADC, like an F5 or like a Citrix, we'll be able to work with those also in terms of enforcing access control, depending on whether or not the device has good hygiene, whether that device is managed by you, or if that device is an end user device, and so on and so forth. So those are really the two demos that I wanted to show. Again, different application risk policies coming from the same user, coming from the same out-of-date device, and you see how we can very easily create policies to differentiate how we handle that access and what the end user actually sees, as well as the self-remediation steps that we've built in for end users to actually go and fix the problem themselves. And the self-remediation piece is actually very important because we actually see close to 55 to 60% reductions in help desk tickets simply by just adding something like this in, where the end user is actually prompted to do the updates themselves rather than calling IT or rather than going to the security team and saying, hey, I can't get access to this. Oh, well, you need to go and update your browser. You need to go and update your operating system, et cetera, et cetera. This actually empowers the end user to do a lot of these things themselves and really takes a heavy burden off of the IT team. So we're going to go ahead and go back into the slides now. That was effectively the demo that we really wanted to show. We're going to open it up. I think we've got about 10 minutes left for Q&A. So anybody that has any questions, happy to take those now.
Great, and we do have our first question, and you can go ahead and continue to enter questions as you think of them. And as your team mentioned, we do just have about 10 minutes left, and then the webinar will conclude. So question number one. Doesn't Microsoft already have MFA built into the O365 EMS platform?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, this is something that we hear a lot from customers, which is, hey, Microsoft already has Azure MFA built into Office 365, and a lot of customers actually either get it for free or get it at a reduced price. So, what would be the value in having a dedicated two-factor vendor do this? And the answer to that is actually can be answered in a couple of different steps, right? The first piece is that the MFA that you're referring to with Azure works really well for certain Microsoft Cloud applications. But the fact of the matter is, unless you are a pure Microsoft Cloud app shop, generally speaking, you will probably need to actually use two-factor authentication, or you need to do some kind of access control for on-premises resources, for maybe your desktop as a service or for your virtual desktop infrastructure. You might have SSH sessions. Even on-premises RDP sessions are things that are typically not protected well with MFA. Both from the end user experience is a little bit shaky, but there are also service and reliability issues with Azure MFA, especially when you're looking to protect both cloud and some on-premises applications. So that's the first piece, is that Azure MFA is really, really good for Microsoft Cloud apps or cloud apps that are in Azure. But most companies and most customers out there have legacy on-premises things that they need to protect that Azure MFA either doesn't support, or you have to actually deploy a separate on-premises server to protect a lot of those legacy on-prem apps. So, if you think about the value that Duo brings into that equation, is that it actually gives you a single platform for securing access to any application. It doesn't matter if it's a cloud application, it doesn't matter if it's an on-premises application. You actually get one user experience for your end users. You get one admin experience to actually look through the dashboards and understand what the threat posture of your devices actually look like in terms of what's out of date, what's up to date, and that spans across your entire application stack, not just for your Microsoft applications. So that's kind of the first piece. The second piece is actually has more or less to do with security architecture, which is that it's generally not good security practice to have the primary credential provider be the same as your secondary credential provider as well. If you think about, if you have your directories either in Azure AD or in ADFS, even on-prem, if Microsoft is breached in Azure AD, your primary credentials are then compromised at that point. If you then use Microsoft as your secondary provider with Azure MFA, it's all part of the same cloud system. And so a single breach with one vendor tends to actually take out multiple layers of redundancy if you're consolidating primary and secondary credentials into the same vendor, which kind of defeats the whole purpose of MFA in the first place, if you think about it, which was supposed to be, if your primary credentials get compromised, you have a secondary set of credentials to really still protect access. But because we're dealing with public cloud infrastructures, the second that public cloud is breached, it's really the primary and the secondary that get breached, especially if you're consolidating those two factors into the same vendor. And that's part of the reason why you see most of the very security conscious organizations, the ones that really have good security practice, tend to separate their primary credential provider and their secondary credential provider.
Great. Now the next question,
since you're front-ending
the login request,
I'm just rereading through this. Since you're front-ending the login request, what if Duo as a service goes down? Does it default to our internal SSO/Federation?
Yeah, so there's a couple of different ways that we handle that. So the way that I'll answer that is two pieces. One, in terms of the service and reliability, we have SLAs for our cloud service of basically maintaining 99.99% uptime from a legality perspective. So we're offering 4 nines from a legality perspective as part of our SLA within any given month. And what we've actually seen from our engineering side and our engineering department and our developer operations department is that we're able to actually extend that availability to actually 5 nines. We've actually gone a significant period of time without having any service outages, even for a brief few minutes or a few seconds. So the likelihood that the Duo service goes down is pretty slim to none. So that's the first thing that I want to address when we're talking about cloud services. The second is, in the event that it does go down, or let's say that the service is not reachable for whatever reason. It might be that your internet connection is slow or gets cut, or it might be that our cloud service goes down. You have different options in terms of whether you want to fail open or fail close that request. Most customers in that case tend to just fail open the request because they don't obviously want to get in the way of what an end user is trying to access or get access to. So if it fails open, again, remember that if you're using us or connecting us to your internal SSO or federation service, we act as the second gate. So it would hit your your federation service first before that request would even get kicked to us. If our service is not available after that for whatever reason, we just kick that back to your federation service, and then the end user gets access to whatever application that they logged into or were trying to log into, depending on what the policy is, whether that's a fail open request or it's a fail close request. And you can customize those fail open, fail close policies depending on the application, depending on the user, and so on and so forth. Those policies are really kind of object-oriented policies, so you can customize them however way you want.
Great. And this
Great.
may be our final question,
just
getting to
the end of the hour here. Is the product licensed by user or by tenant/VM?
Yeah, so the product is licensed by user, so that's the easiest way to answer that. It's a per user per month fee that we have. We have effectively 2 different editions that you can look at. The edition that we're talking about here in terms of being able to provide visibility into your device hygiene, being able to actually control access to different applications based on the device as well as the user, that starts at $6 per user per month. And then the base multi-factor authentication capabilities that would be a little bit more comparable to the other MFA options that you have out there. Obviously, a better experience than most of those, starts at $3 per user per month. Those are our corporate pricing models. For education specific, we do something like a site license, which basically ranges depending on the number of students and the number of staff that you have within your education organization. So for those particular cases, it would be specific to the tenant, not necessarily on a per user amount. But for the most part, for the majority of our business, the product is licensed on a user account basis.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much,
and
thank you to everybody who joined us.
We have just about 1 minute left.
So I wanted to mention that if you have follow-up questions,
we would like you to follow up
with Laura Carr. And on your screen, you can see her email address. That's lkar@duo.com. The phone number is 1-866-760-4247.
And please
join our channel on Bright Talk and follow us for additional webinars. And as mentioned earlier, a recording of this webinar will be provided to you after we conclude.
Thank you, everybody.
And
hope we'll see you again on
another webinar soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.